Barak Medina holds the Justice Chaim Cohen Chair in Human Rights at the Faculty of Law of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He has served as Dean of the Law Faculty and until recently as the Rector, Provost of Hebrew University. So please.
Thank you so much. I should note that Ofra and I are discussing various aspects regarding our current crisis, and Ofra pointed out, hey, this is democratic constitutionalism issue, and I highly recommend everyone who is not familiar with Riva Siegel and Professor Post's set of papers and then a book about the issue of the way constitutional interpretation should be done, taking into account public opinion and public discourse, and we discuss now this perspective as far as it is relevant to our case. But I thought that the current discussion about public discourse is also relevant to the context of judicial review, because we tend to look at judicial review as if it is distinct from public discourse, but as you rightly pointed out, it has relevancy. Again, I of course benefited much from the insightful observations in the paper, and I'll try to offer three short comments. But before doing that, I'll just say that before addressing this, I would like to remind us an immediate biblical association that I had while reading the paper. It is the well-known verse from Leviticus chapter 19, Vayikra Yutet, the parasha just 2 weeks ago, and it reads, I'll say it first in Hebrew and then in English, לא תשנא את אחיך בלבבך, הוכח תוכיח את עמיתך ולא תישא עליו חטא. In English it says, do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart, rebuke your neighbor frankly, so you will not share in their guilt. And it reminds, of course, the editorial of the New York Times. Note that in the Hebrew origin, the requirement to rebuke, to express your disapproval or criticism, is directed towards your brother, achicha, or your friend, amitcha. In the context of chapter 19, the word amitcha refers specifically to a person from your own people, and indeed in the English version it mentions explicitly a fellow Israelite. And if we like, we can read it as referring not only to the private aspect, but as a requirement to rebuke, suggesting that this is a type of behavior that is essential to avoid hate in one's heart. And in the context here, we can read it as basing the idea that expressing your disagreement with your fellows is essential for a proper public discourse. Hence the focus here is on your fellow Israelites, in a sense. But this is just an anecdote. So as I said, I have three short comments referring to the argument. The one is a more general observation. It relates to what Ofra already said. The other is about the framing of the crisis, and the third has to do with freedom of speech principle. I apologize for that of state neutrality, and the context of state neutrality to the debate. So just the more general framework, and this I think Ofra hinted on that when she mentioned that this is a very American paper. It has to do with this underlying notion that if we recognize the principle of freedom of speech, it is necessarily an absolute one. If we recognize the value of autonomy, therefore we are unable to restrain freedom of speech based on autonomy values, the autonomy rights of others, balancing between conflicting interests and things like that. And the same is true about producing of knowledge. So I'm not sure that, if we take into account that the possibility that speech is not necessarily an absolute right, or rights in general might be balanced based on general interest. I think that freedom of speech principle can be based on all three elements, not only the democratic value of free speech, that of the public discourse, but also the two traditional ones. But I will not go into that. It has to do with the way we frame rights, or what we mean by saying that a person has a right, or that the government is restrained by the duty to respect human rights. But I put it in the side. My second comment has to do again with maybe it's now I'm the one who is a bit biased by referring to the Israeli context. And it seems to me that one may offer an alternative way to frame the problem. It seems that Professor Post presents the current crisis as a problem of, and I quote, a problem of radical polarization, a disagreement to be bound by a common fate. And he also adds that Americans no longer seem to inhabit the same factual or normative universe. And I view it as, of course, as an attempt to be impartial, politically neutral in describing the situation. To my view, the crisis that we are facing, again, to extent in the US and here in Israel, is that a growing number of citizens simply defy the ideal of liberalism. It is a position that defies both rational, evidence-based argumentation and toleration in cases of reasonable disagreement. Again, what should trouble us is not the mere existence of polarization as such, disagreement on common faith. The problem is that a growing number of persons participate in the public discourse while using profane or racist expressions and relying, if needed, on intentionally fake information. So I think that the issue that we should address is this concern. It's not only the mere existence of disagreements in our society. And of course, this reality is challenging. It is challenging in various aspects, including that of, as I said, constitutional interpretation and the ideal of democratic constitutionalism. I always have to like to return to Robert Dahl's famous argument more than half a century ago. He wrote, referring to the US, that democracies survive because of the existence of consensus over core preferences. In his word, he says, to assume that the US has remained democratic because of its constitution seems to me an obvious reversal of the relation. It is much more plausible to suppose that the constitution has remained because our society is essentially democratic. And the concern is that if there is no decisive support in this idea of democracy, of liberal democracy, the challenge runs very deep. And again, I leave aside the issue of what is the proper judicial reaction to such reality, and ask ourselves what the freedom of speech doctrine, how it should be constructed given this type of reality. Again, maybe as I said, I'm biased regarding the Israeli reality, but I think it has to do with a more general phenomena of populist leaders, those who support illiberal democracy and things like that. But it might be true to the US as well. And I read Professor Post's argumentation. Again, I put aside the issue of whether we should have a principle, a doctrine of freedom of speech or not. I read it as suggesting, and in this respect, I fully agree with this suggestion, but again, this is just my reading, maybe I'm wrong, that in constructing the freedom of speech doctrine, we should determine what is the social value of protecting freedom of speech. The social value that is at the heart of the discussion is that of public discourse. And the idea is that we should construct freedom of speech doctrine in a way that will make our public discourse a better one that can produce us a healthy democracy. And in this respect, as I said, I fully agree with this call to us lawyers to think about freedom of speech in this context of making public discourse a better one. And this is where I think that we may benefit from thinking anew about this concept of state neutrality. At least as I read and teach American doctrine of freedom of speech, it seems to me that at the heart of the doctrine is the ideal of state neutrality. And it has to do with both using its regulatory power, in terms of content-based regulation of speech, and it has to do with the power of the government in allocating resources, in educating society, in being involved in the marketplace of ideas. And I think that it is an ideal that we should reconstruct given the current situation. I just give two examples that raised this issue of what do we mean by state neutrality, two instances that were relevant here for us in Israel just recently. You just met one of the persons involved in that before the talk. The first example has to do with the decision of the mayor of Tel Aviv to remove political ad posted on a billboard for its offensive message there. He used his regulatory power, probably outside of the formal powers that he has, in order to remove this message that he views as offensive. And the other example, and this has to do with the president of Tel Aviv University, is the decision of heads of public universities here in Israel to suspend all academic activities in protest of the government's plan for judicial overhaul. And these two examples, and of course many more, raise the issue of how far should we go with state neutrality and things like that. And I don't have the time, of course, to elaborate on that. I just say that, at least from my perspective and the way I try to justify it to those who question the legitimacy of at least public universities taking a position in this debate, not only us as individual scholars, but universities as quasi-governmental institutions. And I think to me that the neutrality requirement should be formed based on a normative rather than merely empirical evaluation. The essential element is not whether the relevant issue is publicly debated, is political in the popular sense. The required assessment is whether the governmental action or speech addresses views that are reasonably debated. And the neutrality requirement prohibits the use of regulatory or allocative powers only with respect to views that are in line with basic standards of public discourse. And on the other hand, it is not violated when the government addresses views that are inherently illiberal. And again, it requires delineating what do we mean by that, to what neutrality refers to. But I think it's a path worth exploring, of course, taking into account the risks of empowering the government to make such decisions and things like that. But returning to where I started, the idea that it's if we are into freedom of speech, if we recognize the freedom of speech principle, we should necessarily opt for the corner solution of libertarian absolutist view. I think that we should take into account to make a more comprehensive and careful risk assessments, the risks of both alternatives, and find a middle ground there. But again, as I said, maybe just my own bias about what's going on here. But again, thank you so much for this thought-provoking.